Face it, Grandma Rose. You're broke and useless now, my grandsons sneered as they threw me out of my own home. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leaving to finalize the biggest shock of their greedy little lives. And 3 months later, when that lawyer read my will out loud, the screaming wasn't mine anymore. Before I tell you my story, please make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what you think about family loyalty. Thanks for being here. My name is Rose Catherine Montgomery, and if you told me 6 months ago that my own family would throw me out like garbage while plotting to steal everything I'd worked for, I would have called you crazy. But that's exactly what happened, and I'm going to tell you how a 70-year-old woman who they thought was weak and senile outplayed them all. It all started on a cold Tuesday morning in March, the kind of day when the wind cuts through you and makes you want to stay inside with a cup of tea. I was in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for my family over the years, when I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I figured it might be Mrs. Henderson from next door asking to borrow something again. When I opened the front door, my heart should have lifted with joy. There stood my son Richard, looking handsome in his expensive charcoal suit. Behind him were my daughter-in-law Patricia, perfectly put together as always in her designer coat and pearl earrings. My grandson Marcus, 25 and cocky in his tailored jacket, and my granddaughter Ashley, 23 and beautiful but cold in her trendy outfit. But something was wrong. I'd raised Richard from a baby after his father died in that terrible factory accident when he was just 7 years old. I knew every expression on his face, every mood, every tell, and right now he wasn't looking at me like a son visiting his mother. He was looking at me like a businessman about to close a deal. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice warm, despite the chill I felt. "What a wonderful surprise. Come in, come in." "Mom," Richard said, not even bothering with a hug or a smile. "We need to talk, it's important." Patricia stepped forward, clutching a thick leather folder against her chest like armor. "Rose, we hope you're having a good morning. This won't take long." Rose. Not Ma Montgomery, not even Mrs. Montgomery like she used to call me when they first got married. Just Rose, like I was a stranger or an employee. I led them into my living room, the room I'd spent decades decorating and perfecting. The floral wallpaper I'd hung myself after saving for months, the cherry wood coffee table I'd bought secondhand and refinished, the family photos covering every surface, showing happier times when we all loved each other. Or at least, when I thought we did. "Let me make some coffee," I offered, the way I always did when family visited. "I just baked some chocolate chip cookies yesterday." "Marcus, remember how you used to help me make them when you were little?" Marcus barely glanced at me, too busy scrolling through his phone. "We don't have time for that, Grandma?" Patricia placed her hand on my arm, the gesture seeming caring but feeling cold. "Rose, please sit down. We have some important things to discuss with you." I settled into my favorite armchair, the blue velvet one I'd bought to celebrate paying off the house 20 years ago. Richard sat across from me on the couch while the others remained standing in a semicircle. It felt like an intervention, or worse, like a trial where I was the defendant. "Mom," Richard began, his voice taking on that tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "We've been talking as a family, and we're all very concerned about you living alone at your age." "I'm 70, not 90, I said gently. "And I've been managing just fine. I take my medications, I keep the house clean, I cook for myself, I drive to the grocery store. What exactly are you concerned about?" Ashley finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes in that dramatic way young people do. "Grandma, be honest. When's the last time you actually left this house for something other than groceries or the doctor?" I thought about it. "Well, I went to church last Sunday, and I had lunch with Dorothy Peterson on Thursday, and I went to the library on—" "Dorothy Peterson is 85 and half blind," Marcus interrupted. "And church is basically a senior center. Grandma, you're isolating yourself." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Yes, I'd become more selective about my social activities as I got older. Yes, many of my old friends had passed away or moved to be closer to their children. But I wasn't isolated. I was content. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. and I'd learned to appreciate the peace of my own company. I'm not isolating myself, I said firmly. I'm choosing how to spend my time. There's nothing wrong with preferring a quiet life. Patricia opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them across my coffee table like evidence in a court case. Rose, we need to talk about some specific incidents that have us worried. Incidents? I leaned forward, genuinely confused. What incidents? Last month you forgot to pay your electric bill, Richard said, pulling out a copy of a late notice. ComEd sent this warning, and when I called to check on you, you seemed confused about whether you'd paid it or not. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. I remembered that bill. I'd been sick with a stomach bug for a week, barely able to keep food down, and yes, I'd been a few days late with some payments. But I'd caught up on everything as soon as I felt better. I was sick, I explained. I had that terrible flu that was going around. I caught up on all my bills as soon as I recovered. But you were confused when I called, Richard pressed. You didn't remember if you'd paid it or not. Because I was running a fever, I said, my voice rising slightly. Richard, you've never been confused when you were sick? Patricia pulled out another paper. What about the incident with Mrs. Henderson? She called us last week, very concerned. She said you accused her of moving your garden tools. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. That had been embarrassing, but there was an explanation. I couldn't find my pruning shears, and I saw her using a pair that looked exactly like mine. It was an honest mistake. When I found mine in the garage, I apologized immediately. But you made a scene, Ashley added. Mrs. Henderson said you were shouting at her in front of the other neighbors. I wasn't shouting, I protested, though even as I said it, I remembered that my voice had been raised. I was just frustrated. Those shears were expensive, and I thought they'd been taken. Anyone would have been upset. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. What about 3 weeks ago when you called 911 because you thought someone was breaking into your house? That night came flooding back. I'd been watching television around 10 o'clock when I heard noises in my backyard. Scratching, rustling, the sound of something moving around near my garbage cans. Living alone, what was I supposed to do? Investigate myself? I heard noises, I said defensively. Strange noises in the backyard. I was scared. It was raccoons, Mom, Richard said, his voice patient but condescending. The police found raccoon tracks and scattered garbage. You called emergency services for raccoons. How was I supposed to know they were raccoons? I asked. It was dark, I live alone, and I heard sounds that shouldn't have been there. Any reasonable person would have called for help. Patricia leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but her eyes calculating. Rose, no one is saying you're unreasonable, but these little incidents, they add up. They paint a picture of someone who's starting to struggle with daily life. I'm not struggling, I said firmly. I had the flu, I made one mistake about garden tools, and I called for help when I heard strange noises. These aren't signs of incompetence, they're normal parts of life. What about your driving? Ashley asked. Last month when you drove to the grocery store, you called Dad from the parking lot because you couldn't remember where you parked your car. I did remember that. It had been a particularly busy day at the store, the parking lot was packed, and I'd been distracted by a phone call from my doctor's office while I was walking in. When I came out with my groceries, I had genuinely forgotten which section I'd parked in. It happens to people of all ages. The parking lot was full, I explained. I was distracted when I walked in. People forget where they parked all the time. But you were crying when I found you, Richard said softly. Mom, you were standing there with your groceries, crying because you couldn't find your car. That's not normal. The memory made my chest tight. I had been crying, not because I was confused or scared, but because I'd felt so foolish. Standing there like a lost child, having to call my son for help with something so simple. The tears hadn't been from confusion, they'd been from embarrassment. I was frustrated, I said quietly. It was embarrassing to have to call you. I felt foolish. Patricia pulled out another document, this one with an official-looking letterhead. Rose, we've been researching options, and we found a wonderful place called Sunset Manor. It's an assisted living community about 20 minutes from here. Beautiful grounds, excellent staff, activities every day. She slid a glossy brochure across the table. On the cover was a photo of smiling elderly people playing cards, with a sprawling building in the background that looked more like a hotel than a home. I picked it up with trembling hands, not from age, but from shock. We took the liberty of touring the facility last week, Richard continued. Mom, it's really nice. You'd have your own apartment, but there's help available whenever you need it. Meals provided, housekeeping, medication management, transportation to appointments. And social activities, Ashley added with forced enthusiasm. Game nights, exercise classes, movie screenings. You'd make new friends. I flipped through the brochure, seeing photos of generic common areas and small apartments that looked nothing like home. Everything was beige and sterile, designed to be inoffensive rather than comforting. This looks expensive, I said, though what I really meant was that it looked like a place where people went to wait to die. It is expensive, Marcus admitted. About $4,000 a month for the level of care we think you need. $4,000 a month. My Social Security check was barely $1,800. Even with my small pension from the textile mill, I'd never be able to afford that. I can't afford this, I said simply. Patricia and Richard exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that happens between couples who've been planning something together. That's where your house comes in, Patricia said gently. Rose, this house is too big for you now. It's too much to maintain, too much responsibility. And frankly, it's worth quite a bit of money. My blood went cold. You want me to sell my house? It's the practical solution, Richard said. Mom, this place is huge. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, that big backyard you can't really maintain anymore. It's more house than you need, and the equity could fund your care for years. I looked around my living room, at the walls that had sheltered me and my son for over 4 decades. Every corner held a memory. The spot where Richard had taken his first steps, the window where I'd watched him leave for his first day of school, the mantelpiece where I'd displayed his graduation photos, his wedding pictures, photos of Marcus and Ashley as babies. This is my home, I said quietly. We know it's emotional, Ashley said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone young people use when they think they're being understanding. But Grandma, be practical. You can't maintain this place forever. The roof needs work, the furnace is old, the plumbing makes strange noises. Wouldn't it be better to sell now while you can get a good price, rather than waiting until you're forced to sell in an emergency? I can maintain it just fine, I said, though I knew they were right about some of the repairs. The roof did have a small leak in the back bedroom, and the furnace did make odd sounds sometimes. But those were manageable problems, not reasons to abandon my entire life. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. I looked up comparable houses in your neighborhood, Grandma. Your place could easily sell for $350,000, maybe more. That's enough to pay for Sunset Manor for 6 or 7 years, maybe longer if we invest the money wisely. $350,000. I tried not to react, but the number was much higher than I'd expected. Property values in my neighborhood had apparently increased significantly over the years. We've already spoken to a real estate agent, Patricia continued. Marcia Collins from Prestige Properties. She's very experienced with these kinds of situations. She could have the house listed within a week. You've already spoken to a real estate agent? I repeated, my voice hollow. Without asking me? We wanted to have all the information before we talked to you, Richard explained. We thought it would be better to present you with a complete plan rather than just problems. A complete plan. They'd toured assisted living facilities, spoken to real estate agents, and made decisions about my entire future without including me in any of it. I was being presented with a fait accompli, expected to smile and go along with their arrangements for my life. I don't want to live in an assisted living facility, I said firmly, and I don't want to sell my house. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The masks of concern and caring slipped from their faces, replaced by impatience and frustration. Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this, Richard said, his voice taking on an edge. You can't afford to keep this house and pay for the care you need. And like it or not, you do need care. I don't need care, I insisted. I'm managing fine on my own. Quote. Patricia leaned forward, her voice becoming more direct. Rose, let's be honest. You're 70 years old, living alone in a big house, having incidents that suggest you're struggling more than you want to admit. What happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens when you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you? I have my medical alert button, I said, touching the pendant around my neck. And I have neighbors. And I have you, my family, if I need help. We all have our own lives, Ashley said bluntly. Dad works 60 hours a week. Mom has her real estate business. I'm finishing grad school. And Marcus just started his new job. We can't be checking on you every day. The casual cruelty of the statement took my breath away. They couldn't be bothered to check on me, but they wanted to control where I lived and what I did with my property. I'm not asking you to check on me every day, I said quietly. I'm asking you to let me live my life. Marcus stepped closer, his voice taking on that fake gentle tone that meant he was about to say something hurtful while pretending to be kind. Grandma, we love you. We want what's best for you. But you're being stubborn about this. Sunset Manor isn't a punishment, it's a solution. It's not my solution, I said firmly. Richard stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. When he turned to face me, his expression was harder than I'd ever seen it. Mom, we're trying to do this the easy way. We're trying to involve you in the decision and make this as smooth as possible. But if you won't listen to reason. He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. What are you saying, Richard? Patricia pulled out another document, this one with the letterhead of a law firm. Rose, we've consulted with an attorney about our options if you refuse to accept help voluntarily. My heart started pounding. What kind of options? In cases where an elderly person is no longer capable of making sound decisions about their care and safety, she read from the paper, family members can petition the court for guardianship based on demonstrated incompetence. The words hit me like physical blows. Incompetence. Guardianship. They were threatening to have me declared legally incapable of managing my own life. You would do that to me? I whispered, looking at my son. You would have your own mother declared incompetent? Richard's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Only if you force us to, Mom. Only if you refuse to accept help and put yourself in danger. What danger? I asked, my voice rising. What danger am I in sitting in my own home, living my own life? The danger of falling and lying here for days before anyone finds you, Ashley said. The danger of forgetting to turn off the stove and burning the house down. The danger of getting confused and wandering off. The danger of being taken advantage of by scammers who target elderly people living alone. Each scenario was more ridiculous than the last, but I could see they believed them, or at least they'd convinced themselves they believed them. Those things could happen to anyone, I protested. Young people fall and get hurt. Young people forget to turn off stoves. Young people get scammed. Age doesn't make me inherently more vulnerable to every possible tragedy. But it does make you more vulnerable, Patricia insisted. Rose, be realistic. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be. Your memory isn't perfect. Your judgment might not be as sharp as it once was. My judgment is fine, I said through gritted teeth. My judgment tells me that my family is trying to manipulate me into giving up my independence so they can get their hands on my house. The room went silent. I'd said the quiet part out loud, the thing we were all thinking but pretending wasn't true. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice cold and sharp. That's not fair, Grandma. We're trying to help you. Are you? I asked. Because it seems to me like you've made a lot of plans that benefit you more than they benefit me. You get rid of the responsibility of checking on me, you get the money from selling my house, and you get to feel good about yourselves for putting me somewhere safe. That's a terrible thing to say, Ashley said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. Is it terrible because it's mean, or because it's true? Richard sat back down, rubbing his face with both hands. When he looked at me again, there was something different in his expression, something colder. Mom, let me be very clear about something. Whether you believe it or not, we are trying to help you. We're trying to make sure you're safe and cared for. But we're also trying to protect the family assets. Family assets, I repeated. This is my house, Richard. I paid for it. I maintained it. I lived in it for 42 years. When did it become a family asset? Quote, when you started showing signs that you might not be able to protect it properly, he said bluntly. Mom, what happens if you get dementia? What happens if someone talks you into signing papers you don't understand? What happens if you fall behind on taxes or insurance and lose the house to the bank? None of those things are happening, I said. Not yet, Patricia added. But Rose, we have to plan for the future. We have to protect what you've worked for. From who? I asked. Who exactly are you protecting it from? Marcus stepped forward again, his patience clearly exhausted. From you, Grandma. We're protecting it from you making bad decisions when you're not thinking clearly. The room fell silent again, this time with the weight of complete honesty. They thought I was losing my mind. They thought I was becoming incompetent. And they thought they had the right to take control of my life to prevent me from ruining what they considered their inheritance. I see, I said quietly. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting slightly, and walked to the mantelpiece where I kept my most treasured photos. Pictures of Richard as a baby, as a boy, as a young man. Pictures of him graduating, getting married, holding his own children for the first time. Do you remember, I said without turning around, when you were 12 and you wanted that bicycle for Christmas? The red one with the racing stripes? Mom, what does that have to do with... Do you remember? I asked again, turning to face him. Yes, he said reluctantly. I worked double shifts for 2 months to afford that bike. Christmas morning, when you saw it under the tree, you cried. You said it was the best Christmas ever. You said I was the best mom in the world. Richard's expression softened slightly. I remember. I want you to think about that boy, I said quietly. That boy who thought his mother was the best in the world. And I want you to ask yourself what that boy would think about what you're doing to that same mother today. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. I thought I'd reminded him of who we used to be to each other. Then Patricia stood up, her voice sharp and final. Rose, we're not 12-year-old boys impressed by Christmas presents. We're adults dealing with an adult situation. And frankly, guilt trips aren't going to change the facts. What facts? I asked. The fact that you can't live alone safely anymore, she said. The fact that this house is too much for you to handle. The fact that you need care whether you want to admit it or not. And the fact that we're the ones who will have to deal with the consequences if something happens to you. The consequences, I repeated. You mean the inconvenience. Ashley stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Grandma, that's not fair. We love you. We want you to be safe and happy. But we also have our own lives, our own responsibilities. We can't drop everything every time you have a crisis. When have I ever asked you to drop everything for me? I asked. When have I ever had a crisis that required you to sacrifice anything? You called Dad crying about your car, Marcus said. You called the police about raccoons. You accused Mrs. Henderson of stealing your garden tools. These things don't happen in isolation, Grandma. They're part of a pattern. A pattern. They'd taken 3 minor incidents spread over several months and turned them into evidence of my declining mental capacity. I see what this is, I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. You've already made up your minds. You've decided I'm incompetent. You've decided what needs to happen. And this whole conversation is just a formality. You're not asking for my opinion. You're informing me of your decision. Richard stood up, his face flushed. Mom, that's not. It is, I said firmly. You've toured assisted living facilities. You've spoken to real estate agents. You've consulted with lawyers about having me declared incompetent. You've made every possible preparation, except the one that mattered most, asking me what I want. We're asking you now, Patricia said. No, you're not. You're telling me what you've decided and asking me to cooperate with it. There's a difference. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the cold March air sweep into my warm living room. I think you should leave now, I said calmly. Mom, we're not finished talking about this, Richard said. Yes, we are. This is my house, and I'm asking you to leave. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. And then what, Grandma? You think this conversation is over just because you kick us out? I think this conversation was over before it started, I said. You didn't come here to talk to me. You came here to manage me. Patricia gathered her papers back into her folder, her movements sharp and angry. Rose, you have 24 hours to think about this. After that, we're moving forward with or without your cooperation. With what? With getting you the help you need, Richard said, one way or another. They filed past me one by one. Ashley muttered something under her breath about stubborn old people. Marcus was already on his phone, probably texting someone about what a difficult grandmother he had. Patricia paused at the door, her voice low and threatening. "Rose, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to be kind about this, but if you force our hand..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Cooperate, or they'd take legal action to force me. Richard was the last to leave. He paused on the threshold, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I hoped he might apologize, might remember that I was his mother and not just an obstacle to his plans. Instead, he said, "This is for your own good, Mom. Someday you'll understand that." Then he was gone, and I was alone in my house with their threats hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding not from fear but from anger. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought they could manipulate me into giving up everything I'd worked for. They thought I was just a helpless old woman with no options and no fight left in her. They thought I was poor and powerless. They had no idea how wrong they were. And they were about to find out just how much this broke old lady had been hiding from them all these years. I stood in my empty living room for a long time after they left, my back still pressed against the front door as if I could somehow keep their threats from seeping back in. The house felt different now, violated somehow, like strangers had been through my personal belongings even though they'd never left the living room. 24 hours. That's what Patricia had said. 24 hours to think about this before they moved forward with their plans. As if there was anything to think about. As if they hadn't already made every decision without me. I walked slowly back to my armchair and sank into the familiar cushions, but even that comfort felt tainted now. They'd sat in this very room and plotted my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. My own son, the boy I'd raised alone, had threatened to have me declared incompetent if I didn't cooperate with their schemes. The papers they'd left behind were still scattered across my coffee table like evidence of a crime. I picked up the Sunset Manor brochure first, studying the glossy photos more carefully. Happy elderly people playing board games. A woman tending to a small garden plot. Residents gathered in a beige dining room, smiling at cameras while eating what looked like institutional food. $4,000 a month for this artificial happiness. $4,000 to give up my independence, my privacy, my home, my life as I knew it. And they wanted me to be grateful for the privilege. I set the brochure aside and picked up the real estate information Marcus had printed from his phone. Comparable home sales in my neighborhood, all with prices that made my head spin. When had houses become so expensive? When had my little piece of the world become worth so much money? $350,000. Maybe more. I tried to imagine that much money, tried to understand what it meant to people like Richard and Patricia, who were clearly struggling with their own finances despite their expensive clothes and fancy cars. Richard's job at the insurance company paid well, but not well enough to support their lifestyle without stress. Patricia's real estate business was competitive and unpredictable. Marcus was drowning in student loan debt from his business degree. Ashley was still in graduate school, funded entirely by her parents. To them, my house wasn't a home. It was a solution to their financial pressures, wrapped in the convenient excuse of concern for my welfare. But there was something they didn't know, something none of them had ever bothered to ask about or investigate. They assumed I was living on Social Security and a small pension, barely scraping by in a house I could no longer afford to maintain. They had no idea what I'd been doing for the past 30 years. After my husband died in that factory accident, I'd received a settlement from the company. Not a huge amount, but enough to pay off the house and leave me with a small sum to invest. I was 37 years old, widowed, with a 7-year-old son to raise, and I knew I couldn't depend on anyone else to secure our future. So I'd done something that seemed impossible at the time. I'd learned about money. I'd spent hours at the library, reading books about investing and financial planning. I'd attended free seminars at the community center. I'd started small, investing a few $100s at a time in mutual funds and bonds, learning from every mistake, and reinvesting every gain. While I worked my shifts at the textile mill and raised Richard, I'd also been quietly, methodically building wealth. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just consistent, patient, smart investing over decades. By the time Richard graduated from college, I had enough money invested to pay his tuition without touching the principal. When he got married, I could have bought them a house as a wedding gift, but they never asked, and I never offered. I'd learned early that money changes relationships, and I wanted Richard to succeed on his own merits. Over the years, I'd watched my investments grow. I'd rolled over my 401k from the mill into larger, more sophisticated portfolios. I'd bought and sold stocks, reinvested dividends, diversified across sectors and geographies. I'd even bought a few rental properties in neighboring towns, small apartment buildings that provided steady income. My financial advisor, Thomas Brennan, had been managing my accounts for 15 years. He was a quiet, discreet man who understood that I preferred to keep my wealth private. We met quarterly to review my portfolio, and every 3 months he delivered the same message. My assets were growing steadily, my income was more than sufficient for my needs, and I was wealthier than most people realized. Much wealthier. As of my last quarterly review 3 weeks ago, my total assets were worth just over $4.2 million. $4.2 million. Not the broke old woman my family imagined, scraping by on government checks and struggling to pay utility bills. I was a millionaire several times over, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever touching the principal. I could have told them this during our confrontation. I could have shut down their entire argument by showing them my bank statements and investment portfolios. I could have proven that I wasn't the helpless, impoverished woman they thought I was. But I didn't. And there was a reason for that. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. I wanted to know what kind of people my family really were when they thought I had nothing to defend myself with. I wanted to understand whether their concern was genuine or whether it was all about money. Now I knew. I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, pulling out a thick folder I'd been maintaining for the past several months. Inside were printed emails, bank records, legal documents, and a detailed timeline I'd been keeping of every interaction with my family since I'd first started noticing changes in their behavior. It had started subtly, about 6 months ago. Casual questions about my finances, offhand comments about how expensive it must be to maintain such a large house, suggestions that I might be happier in a smaller place, observations about my age, and how difficult it must be to live alone. At first, I'd attributed these comments to normal family concern. Children worry about their aging parents. It's natural and healthy for them to think about my future needs and safety. But as the months passed, the questions became more pointed and the suggestions more insistent. Richard had started dropping by unannounced, not to visit, but to inspect. He'd walk through my house looking for problems, pointing out maintenance issues I hadn't noticed, commenting on how much work it must be to keep everything clean. Patricia had begun making remarks about my appearance, my memory, my social life. Nothing overtly critical, just little observations that planted seeds of doubt. Rose, are you feeling okay? You seem a little confused today. Rose, didn't we just talk about this yesterday? Rose, are you sure you should be driving at night? Quote, the kids had started treating me differently too. Where they used to ask about my life and interests, now they spoke to me like I was a child who needed simple explanations and constant reassurance. Marcus would repeat himself when talking to me, speaking slowly and loudly as if I were hard of hearing. Ashley would pat my arm and use that sing-song voice people reserve for babies and the elderly. I'd started documenting these interactions because something felt wrong about them. The pattern was too consistent, too coordinated. It felt like they were building a case for something, creating a narrative about my declining capabilities. And today, I'd learned exactly what that case was for. I pulled out my laptop and began typing, creating a detailed account of everything that had happened during their visit. Their demands, their threats, their casual dismissal of my autonomy. I noted the time, the date, who said what, and how they'd coordinated their arguments. This wasn't the first time a family had tried to manipulate an elderly relative for financial gain. I'd read about it, heard stories from other seniors, seen news reports about adult children who convinced courts that their parents were incompetent in order to gain control of their assets. But it was the first time it had happened to me, and the betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. My phone rang, interrupting my documentation. The caller ID showed Thomas Brennan's office number. "Hello, Thomas," I said, settling back in my chair. "Rose, good afternoon. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Actually, your timing is perfect. I was just thinking I might need to speak with you soon." "Excellent. I was calling because I've been reviewing your accounts in preparation for our quarterly meeting next week, and there are some investment opportunities I'd like to discuss with you. Also, we need to review your estate planning documents. It's been 3 years since we updated your will." My will. I'd almost forgotten about the document Thomas had helped me draft, the legal framework that would distribute my assets after my death. It was a simple document, reflecting the simple family structure I'd thought I had at the time. "Thomas, I think I might need to make some changes to that will sooner than planned." "Oh, what kind of changes?" "Significant ones. Can we meet this week instead of next?" "Of course. How about Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock? "Perfect. Thomas, can I ask you something?" "Certainly." "If someone were trying to have me declared incompetent, what would that process look like?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thomas had been my advisor long enough to know that I didn't ask theoretical questions. "Rose, is there something I should know about?" "There might be. Can you explain the process?" "Well, in Illinois, a family member can petition the court for guardianship if they believe someone is unable to make decisions about their own care and safety. They'd need to provide evidence of incompetence, usually medical records or documented incidents that suggest cognitive decline or poor judgment." "What kind of evidence?" "Things like unpaid bills, confusion about daily tasks, dangerous driving, falling victim to scams, wandering, that sort of thing. The court would typically order a medical evaluation and possibly appoint a guardian ad litem to investigate the claims. And if they succeeded? If the court granted guardianship, the guardian would have legal authority to make decisions about where you live, how your money is spent, what medical care you receive, essentially all major life decisions. Even if the person objects? Even if the person objects, that's the point of the process, to protect people who are no longer capable of protecting themselves." I was quiet for a moment, processing this information. My family could literally take control of my entire life if they convinced a judge that I was incompetent. They could force me into assisted living, sell my house, and manage my money without my consent. Of course, they'd be in for quite a shock when they discovered how much money there actually was to manage. "Thomas, hypothetically, if someone filed such a petition against me, what would be my best defense?" "Evidence of competence, clear thinking, good decision-making, proper management of finances, social connections, independence in daily activities. Basically, you'd need to demonstrate that you're fully capable of managing your own life." "I see. And would my financial records be part of that evaluation?" "Absolutely. The court would want to see that you're managing your money responsibly, paying bills on time, not falling victim to scams, or making impulsive financial decisions." "That's interesting. Rose, are you concerned about something specific?" I considered how much to tell him. Thomas was bound by confidentiality, and I trusted him completely, but I also wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of what I was dealing with. "Let's just say I want to make sure all my affairs are in order," I said finally. "Of course. We'll cover everything on Thursday. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "Actually, yes. I'd like you to prepare a complete financial summary for me. All accounts, all assets, current values, income statements for the past year, everything in one document." "That's not a problem. Any particular reason?" "I might need to prove my competence to some people who seem to doubt it." There was another pause. "Rose, if you're dealing with family pressure about your finances or living situation, please know that you have resources and options. You don't have to make decisions under duress." "Thank you, Thomas. That's exactly what I needed to hear." After I hung up, I felt calmer and more focused. I had allies I could call on, professionals who knew my true situation and could testify to my competence if necessary. My family thought they held all the cards, but they were about to learn that they'd been playing against someone with a much stronger hand than they realized. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching guardianship laws in Illinois, reading case studies and legal precedents. I wanted to understand exactly what my family would have to prove to succeed in their plans, and what I would need to do to defend myself. What I learned was both alarming and reassuring. Alarming because the bar for proving incompetence was lower than I'd expected. A few documented incidents of confusion or poor judgment, combined with testimony from concerned family members, could be enough to convince a judge that intervention was necessary. But it was also reassuring because the process required actual evidence, not just allegations, medical evaluations, financial records, testimony from neutral parties. My family would have to prove their case, not just assert it. And when the court looked at my medical records, they'd find a healthy 70-year-old woman with no cognitive issues. When they examined my financial records, they'd discover someone who'd been managing complex investments successfully for decades. When they interviewed my doctor, my financial advisor, my neighbors, they'd hear testimony about a competent, independent woman who was fully capable of making her own decisions. The irony was perfect. My family's greed had led them to threaten legal action that would ultimately expose their own deception and possibly subject them to legal consequences of their own. That evening, I made a list of people I could call as character witnesses if needed. Dr. Sarah Chen, my primary care physician for the past 12 years. Father Miguel Santos from St. Mary's Church, where I'd been a parishioner for decades. Dorothy Peterson, my friend and former coworker. Even Mrs. Henderson, despite our recent misunderstanding about the garden tools. I also made a list of the evidence I could present to demonstrate my competence. My investment portfolios, managed successfully for 30 years. My medical records, showing regular checkups and no cognitive decline. My driving record, spotless except for one parking ticket 3 years ago. My home, well-maintained and organized. But as I worked on these lists, I realized something important. I didn't want to just defend myself against their accusations. I wanted to understand why they'd made them in the first place. When had Richard stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a burden? When had Patricia decided I was an obstacle to their financial security? When had my grandchildren begun thinking of me as an inconvenience rather than a person they loved? I thought back over the past year, looking for clues I might have missed. Richard's visits had become less frequent and more purposeful. Instead of coming by just to chat or share a meal, he'd started showing up with specific agendas, checking on my bills, inspecting my house for problems, asking pointed questions about my daily routine. Patricia had stopped inviting me to family gatherings, claiming they wanted to keep things small or that I might be more comfortable at home. When I did attend events, she'd hover nearby, ready to jump in if I seemed confused or needed help with simple tasks. The grandchildren had become polite but distant, treating me like an elderly relative they were obligated to visit, rather than someone they genuinely wanted to spend time with. I had attributed these changes to the natural evolution of family relationships. Children grow up, move away, develop their own lives and priorities. It's normal for the dynamics to shift as everyone gets older. But now I wondered if something else had been happening. Had they been meeting without me, discussing my future, making plans? Had they decided months ago that I was becoming a problem that needed to be managed? The thought made me angry all over again, not just because they'd deceived me, but because they'd underestimated me so completely. They'd looked at a 70-year-old widow living alone and seen vulnerability and decline. They'd assumed I was financially naive, socially isolated, and mentally fragile. They'd never bothered to really know me as an adult, to understand what I'd accomplished or what I was capable of. To them, I was just their elderly mother and grandmother, someone to be protected and managed rather than respected and consulted. Well, they were about to learn just how wrong they'd been about all of it. I opened my laptop again and began researching something else. Estate planning strategies for people who wanted to ensure their assets went to deserving recipients rather than entitled family members. The options were more extensive than I'd realized. Charitable trusts, private foundations, specific bequests to organizations and individuals. I could leave my money to causes I cared about, to people who'd shown me genuine kindness, to institutions that made a difference in the world. I could also structure my estate in ways that would send clear messages about why certain people were excluded from my inheritance. Legal documents that explained my reasoning, detailed accounts of their behavior, provisions that made my intentions unmistakably clear. My family wanted to treat me like I was incompetent, They wanted to manipulate me for financial gain. They wanted to dismiss my autonomy and override my decisions about my own life. Fine, they could do all of those things. But they were going to be very disappointed with the results. I worked late into the night, researching and planning and documenting. By the time I finally went to bed, I had the beginnings of a strategy that would accomplish several goals at once. I would demonstrate my competence so thoroughly that any legal challenge would be doomed to fail. I would protect my assets from people who saw them as solutions to their own problems, rather than the result of my lifetime of work. And I would make sure that my family understood exactly what they'd lost by choosing manipulation over love. But most importantly, I would take back control of my own story. For too long, I'd let other people define me by their expectations and assumptions. I'd allowed my family to see me as weak and dependent because it was easier than asserting my strength and independence. That was about to change. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity and purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had work to do, plans to make, and a future to secure on my own terms. My family thought they had 24 hours to wait for my capitulation to their demands. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd given me 24 hours to prepare for war. And I intended to win it decisively. I started with a phone call to my doctor's office, scheduling a complete physical and cognitive evaluation. If my family wanted to question my mental competence, I'd have recent medical documentation proving otherwise. Then I called my insurance agent to review my homeowner's policy and schedule any necessary inspections or updates. If they wanted to claim my house was too much for me to maintain, I'd have professional assessments proving it was in excellent condition. I contacted my accountant to prepare detailed financial statements showing my bill-paying history and money management skills. If they wanted to suggest I was financially irresponsible, I'd have years of evidence to the contrary. And finally, I called Thomas Brennan back to move our meeting up even earlier. Thomas, it's Rose. Could we possibly meet tomorrow instead of Thursday? Something has come up that requires immediate attention. Of course. Is 10 o'clock too early? 10 o'clock is perfect. And Thomas? I think we're going to need to completely restructure my estate plan, all of it. I see. May I ask what's prompted this urgency? You may ask, and I'll tell you everything tomorrow. But for now, let's just say I've learned some things about my family that have significantly changed my perspective on how I want my assets distributed. I understand. I'll prepare some options for you to consider. Thank you. And, Thomas, this conversation stays between us, correct? Absolutely. Attorney-client privilege protects everything we discuss. Good. Because what I'm about to propose is going to shock some people, and I want to make sure they don't see it coming. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future. Not the future my family had planned for me, full of institutional care and managed decline, but a future I would create for myself. A future where I controlled my own destiny and made my own choices about how to spend my remaining years. A future where people who tried to manipulate and control me would learn that there were consequences for underestimating a woman who'd survived widowhood, raised a child alone, built wealth from nothing, and managed her own life successfully for 7 decades. My family wanted to play games with my future? Fine, let the games begin. But they were about to discover that I was much better at this particular game than they'd ever imagined. And by the time I was finished, they'd understand that the sweet, vulnerable old lady they thought they could manipulate had been an illusion all along. The real Rose Montgomery was about to emerge from hiding. And she was magnificent. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, one of those late March days when winter finally loosens its grip and you can smell spring in the air. I woke up at 6:30, the same time I'd been waking up for 40 years, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely energized about the day ahead. I had appointments to keep, evidence to gather, and a war to prepare for. My first stop was Dr. Chen's office for the complete physical and cognitive evaluation I'd scheduled. Sarah Chen had been my doctor for 12 years, ever since Dr. Morrison retired, and she knew me well enough to be surprised by my request for such a comprehensive examination. "Rose, you just had your annual physical 3 months ago," she said, reviewing my chart in her familiar, efficient way. Everything was perfectly normal. Blood pressure excellent. Cholesterol levels good. No concerning symptoms. What's prompted this sudden need for additional testing? I'd prepared for this question during my drive to the medical center. Dr. Chen, my family has expressed some concerns about my mental sharpness and my ability to live independently. I want to have current, comprehensive documentation of my cognitive and physical health. She looked up from the chart, her dark eyes sharp with understanding. Sarah Chen had been practicing geriatric medicine long enough to recognize the signs of family interference in an elderly patient's life. I see. What kind of concerns? They think I'm becoming forgetful and making poor decisions. They want me to move to assisted living and are threatening legal action if I refuse. Dr. Chen set down her tablet and gave me her full attention. Rose, in all the years I've been treating you, I've never seen any signs of cognitive decline. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are sharp, and you manage your healthcare independently and responsibly. You take your medications correctly, you keep all your appointments, you follow medical advice. What specific incidents have they cited? I told her about the late electric bill during my illness, the confusion about the parking lot when I was distracted, the misunderstanding with Mrs. Henderson about the garden tools. As I described each incident, I watched her expression shift from concern to irritation. Those are completely normal experiences, she said firmly. Being sick affects everyone's ability to manage daily tasks temporarily. Everyone has moments of distraction in busy parking lots. Misunderstandings between neighbors happen all the time. None of these things suggest cognitive impairment. That's what I thought, but they seem to view them as evidence of declining mental capacity. Then they either don't understand normal aging, or they're looking for problems that don't exist. Her tone was sharp now, the way it got when she encountered family members who interfered with her patient's care. Rose, I want to be very clear about something. Based on my professional assessment, you are a healthy, competent 70-year-old woman with no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or mental illness. Your judgment is sound, your memory is excellent, and you are fully capable of making your own decisions about your life and healthcare. Would you be willing to document that assessment officially? Absolutely. I'll run every cognitive test we have, order updated lab work, and provide you with a comprehensive report that clearly states my professional opinion about your mental and physical competence. And Rose? Yes? If your family tries to have you declared incompetent based on the incidents you've described, they're going to have a very difficult time convincing any court that knows how to evaluate evidence. The tests took most of the morning. Memory assessments, problem-solving exercises, coordination tests, blood work, heart monitoring, the full battery of evaluations used to assess elderly patients. Dr. Chen was thorough and professional, but I could see the anger in her eyes as she worked. She'd seen too many families use medical concerns as pretexts for financial manipulation. By the time we finished, I felt confident that my medical records would be unassailable. Whatever else my family might claim about me, they wouldn't be able to argue that I was mentally incompetent. My next stop was the bank, where I met with Janet Morrison, the branch manager who'd been handling my accounts for 8 years. I needed current statements for all my accounts, including ones my family didn't know existed. Mrs. Montgomery, it's good to see you, Janet said, settling into her office chair with a stack of files. I have all the statements you requested. Is there anything specific you're looking for? I need documentation that shows I've been managing my finances responsibly and independently. Payment histories, investment decisions, account management over time. Quote, Janet spread the statements across her desk, and even I was impressed by what they showed. 30 years of consistent investing, careful money management, bills paid on time, strategic financial decisions that had grown my initial small nest egg into substantial wealth. Mrs. Montgomery, these records show exemplary financial management, Janet said. You've never missed a payment, never overdrawn an account, never made impulsive financial decisions. Your investment strategy has been conservative but effective. Frankly, these are some of the best managed accounts in our system. Would you be willing to provide a letter stating that professional assessment? Of course. May I ask why you need this documentation? I explained the situation briefly, watching Janet's expression grow increasingly incredulous. They want to have you declared incompetent? Mrs. Montgomery, you're one of our most financially sophisticated clients. You understand complex investment strategies better than most people half your age. Any financial professional who looked at these records would immediately recognize your competence. That's exactly what I need to prove. Janet printed out detailed statements going back 5 years, highlighting patterns that demonstrated consistent good judgment and financial acumen. She also prepared a letter on bank letterhead, documenting my competence in managing complex financial affairs. Mrs. Montgomery, she said as I prepared to leave, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your family sounds like they don't know you very well. No, I agreed. They really don't. My afternoon appointment was with Thomas Brennan at his downtown office. Thomas had been managing my investment portfolio for 15 years, and his office reflected the quiet competence that had made me trust him with my financial future. Dark wood furniture, wall-to-wall law books, and charts showing market performance over decades. Rose, good to see you, he said, standing to greet me with a firm handshake. I have to say, your phone call yesterday has me concerned. What exactly are we dealing with? I told him everything. The family meeting, their demands, their threats of legal action, their complete ignorance of my true financial situation. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. I see, he said when I finished. And they have no idea about your actual net worth? None whatsoever. They think I'm living paycheck to paycheck on Social Security and a small pension. $4.2 million is hardly paycheck to paycheck. That's my point. They're trying to manipulate someone they think is financially vulnerable when in reality I'm probably wealthier than all of them combined. Thomas pulled out a thick folder containing my complete financial profile. Rose, let's review what we're working with, just to be clear about the scope of your assets. He spread the documents across his desk like a general planning a military campaign. Stock portfolios, bond holdings, mutual funds, real estate investments, cash accounts, retirement funds. The numbers were impressive even to me, despite having watched them grow over the years. Your primary investment portfolio is currently valued at $2.8 million, he said, pointing to the largest statement. Your real estate holdings, including the 3 apartment buildings, are worth approximately $800,000. Your savings and money market accounts total $400,000. Your retirement accounts add another $200,000. And my house? Based on current market conditions, probably $400,000, possibly more. So your total net worth is approaching $5 million. $5 million. I'd known I was wealthy, but seeing it laid out so clearly was still overwhelming. Thomas, I want to restructure my entire estate plan. All of it. What kind of restructuring? I took a deep breath. This was the moment I committed to a course of action that would change everything. I want to disinherit my family completely. Thomas didn't react with surprise or try to talk me out of it. He'd been in estate planning long enough to understand that families could destroy relationships through greed and manipulation. That's certainly your right, he said. But I want to make sure you understand the implications. Once we restructure your will, there's no going back if you change your mind. I won't change my mind. Thomas, they threatened to have me declared incompetent so they could control my assets. They've been lying to me, manipulating me, and planning my future without my consent. They see me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a person deserving of respect and autonomy. What would you like to do instead? I'd been thinking about this all night, and I had a clear vision of how I wanted my wealth distributed. I want to establish a charitable foundation focused on elder advocacy and abuse prevention. I want to fund programs that help elderly people maintain their independence and protect them from family manipulation. I want to support organizations that provide legal aid to seniors facing guardianship challenges. Thomas made notes as I spoke, nodding approvingly. That's an excellent legacy goal. What about specific bequests? I want to leave substantial gifts to people who've shown me genuine kindness and respect. Dr. Chen, who's provided excellent medical care and advocates for her elderly patients. Janet Morrison at the bank, who's helped me manage my finances professionally. Father Santos at my church, who's been a true friend. Dorothy Peterson, who's been loyal despite my family's attempts to isolate me. And your family? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, I want the will to explicitly state that they're excluded because of their attempts to manipulate and control me. Thomas set down his pen and looked at me seriously. Rose, that's a powerful statement. Are you sure you want to be that explicit? I want them to understand exactly why they're being disinherited. I want there to be no doubt about my reasoning or my mental state when I made these decisions. We can certainly do that. We can include a detailed explanation of your reasoning, along with documentation of your competence at the time you signed the will. Perfect. How long will this take? I can have a draft ready by early next week. But Rose, I want to suggest something else. What? Let's also prepare a comprehensive competency file. Medical evaluations, financial records, character references, evidence of your independent living skills. If your family does try to challenge your mental capacity, we'll be ready with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd suggest. Thomas pulled out a legal pad and began outlining the documents we'd need. Medical records, financial statements, testimony from professionals who worked with me, evidence of my daily living skills and social connections. I'll also want to involve Dr. Chen directly, he said. If there's a legal challenge, having your physician testify about your competence will be crucial. She's already agreed to help. Excellent. Rose, by the time we're finished, you'll have the most ironclad estate plan and competency documentation I've ever prepared. If your family wants to challenge your decisions, they're going to find themselves fighting a battle they can't possibly win. We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of my new estate plan. The charitable foundation would receive the bulk of my assets, with clear instructions about how the money should be used. Specific individuals would receive substantial but not overwhelming gifts, enough to change their lives without creating complications. And my family would receive a very detailed explanation of why they'd been excluded, along with copies of all the evidence supporting my decision. There's one more thing I want to include, I said as we were finishing up. What's that? I want the will reading to be mandatory for all beneficiaries and excluded parties. I want my family to have to sit there and listen while the lawyer reads exactly what they're not getting and why. Thomas smiled, the first time he'd shown any emotion during our meeting. That's deliciously appropriate. We can absolutely include a provision requiring attendance at the will reading. And Thomas? I want to make sure this will is unbreakable. No loopholes, no grounds for challenge, no way for them to overturn my decisions. Consider it done. We'll include competency evaluations, multiple witnesses, video documentation of your signing the will, everything needed to prove your mental capacity and the validity of your decisions. As I drove home that evening, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. For months, I'd been reacting to my family's manipulation and control attempts. Now I was taking charge, making my own decisions and preparing for whatever challenges they might throw at me. But I also felt a deep sadness about what had been lost. The family relationships I'd treasured, the legacy I'd hoped to leave, the simple pleasure of being loved and respected by the people closest to me. All of that was gone, destroyed by their greed and their inability to see me as anything more than a source of financial security. Still, I didn't regret my decisions. They'd shown me who they really were when they thought I was vulnerable and powerless. Now they were about to learn who I really was when I had the resources and determination to fight back. That evening, I began making phone calls to gather character references and arrange for additional documentation of my competence. Father Santos agreed to provide a letter about my active participation in church activities and my clear thinking during our conversations about theology and community service. Dorothy Peterson was eager to help, having suspected for months that my family was treating me poorly. She offered to document our friendship and the sharpness of my mind during our regular conversations about books, politics, and current events. Even Mrs. Henderson, when I called to apologize again for the misunderstanding about the garden tools, expressed surprise that anyone would question my mental capacity. Rose, you're one of the sharpest people in this neighborhood, she said. If your family thinks you're losing your mind, they haven't been paying attention. By the end of the evening, I had commitments from 6 different people to provide written testimony about my competence, my character, and my ability to live independently. I had medical documentation, financial records, and legal representation that would make any challenge to my decisions extremely difficult to sustain. But most importantly, I had something my family had tried to take away from me: control over my own life and future. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. I met with contractors to inspect my house and document its excellent condition. I organized my financial records into clear, easy-to-understand summaries. I scheduled additional appointments with Dr. Chen for follow-up testing and documentation. I also began researching elder advocacy organizations, looking for the most effective groups to support with my charitable foundation. I wanted my money to go to programs that would actually help elderly people maintain their independence and dignity, not just generic charity work. The more I learned about elder abuse and family manipulation, the angrier I became. What my family was doing to me wasn't unique. Thousands of elderly people faced similar pressure from relatives who saw their aging parents and grandparents as financial opportunities, rather than human beings deserving of respect. My foundation would help change that. It would fund legal advocacy, support independent living programs, and educate families about the difference between genuine concern and manipulative control. 3 days after my family's ultimatum, Richard called. "Mom, we need to talk." "About what?" "You know what? It's been 3 days. We need to know your decision about Sunset Manor." Quote, I'd been expecting this call, and I was ready for it. "My decision is no. I'm not moving to assisted living. I'm not selling my house. And I'm not accepting your interference in my life." "Mom, we talked about this. If you won't cooperate voluntarily, you'll try to have me declared incompetent." "Yes, Richard, I remember your threat." "It's not a threat. It's a necessary step to protect you from your own poor judgment." "My poor judgment?" "Richard, I've been managing my life successfully for 70 years. I raised you as a single mother, paid for your education, maintained my home, managed my finances, and stayed healthy and independent. What exactly suggests poor judgment to you?" "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this. You can't see the problems we can see." "What problems? Be specific." "The incident with the electric bill, the confusion in the parking lot, the paranoia about Mrs. Henderson." "Richard, stop. I was sick when I paid the bills late, and I caught up immediately. I was distracted in the parking lot for 5 minutes. I made one mistake about garden tools and apologized as soon as I realized it. These are normal human experiences, not signs of incompetence." "They're patterns, Mom. Signs that you're not managing as well as you think you are." "According to who? Have you spoken to Dr. Chen about my health? Have you reviewed my financial records? Have you talked to anyone who actually knows me about my mental state?" "We don't need to. You don't need to gather actual evidence before trying to have me declared incompetent." "Richard, do you understand how serious that accusation is?" There was a pause, and I could hear voices in the background, Patricia coaching him through the conversation. "Mom, we're trying to help you. We love you and want what's best for you. If you loved me, you would have included me in decisions about my own life. If you wanted what's best for me, you would have asked what I wanted instead of telling me what you'd already decided." "We're filing the petition next week," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm sorry it's come to this, but you're leaving us no choice." "Actually, Richard, you do have a choice. You could respect my autonomy and accept that I'm capable of making my own decisions. But if you choose to file that petition, you should know that I'm prepared to defend myself." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've had comprehensive medical and cognitive evaluations that prove my competence. I have financial records showing 30 years of excellent money management. I have character references from people who know me well. If you want to challenge my mental capacity in court, you're going to need a lot more evidence than a few minor incidents blown out of proportion." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, why are you making this so difficult?" "I'm not making anything difficult, Richard. I'm simply refusing to be manipulated into giving up my independence. If that's difficult for you, maybe you should examine your own motivations." "Fine. We'll see you in court." He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me staring at the phone and feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. They were really going to do it. They were going to try to have their own mother declared incompetent for the crime of refusing to cooperate with their financial plans. But I was ready for them. More than ready. I was about to show them what a competent, well-prepared 70-year-old woman could accomplish when she decided to fight back with everything she had. And I had a lot more than they realized. Part 4, the breaking point. The following week passed like the calm before a hurricane. I went about my daily routine, grocery shopping, church services, afternoon walks around my neighborhood. But underneath the surface, I was preparing for war. Every morning brought new documentation, more evidence, stronger proof of my competence and my family's deception. Thomas Brennan called on Tuesday with an update on my new will. Rose, I have the first draft ready for your review. I think you'll find it quite comprehensive. How comprehensive? 37 pages. We've included detailed explanations for every decision, complete documentation of your mental capacity, and ironclad legal language that will make any challenge extremely difficult to sustain. And the charitable foundation? The Montgomery Foundation for Elder Advocacy will be established with $4 million in initial funding. The mission statement specifies programs for elder independence, legal advocacy against family manipulation, and educational initiatives about elder abuse. It's going to change a lot of lives, Rose. $4 million for elder advocacy. The irony was perfect. My family's attempt to control me would ultimately fund programs to help other elderly people resist similar manipulation. When can we finalize everything? Friday afternoon. I want to video record the signing ceremony, with multiple witnesses who can testify to your mental clarity during the process. Dr. Chen has agreed to be present as a medical witness. Perfect. But even as I made these preparations, part of me hoped my family would come to their senses. I found myself checking my phone for calls that never came, wondering if Richard might reach out to apologize, if Patricia might realize how far they'd gone, if the grandchildren might remember that they'd once claimed to love me. That hope died on Wednesday morning when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door, holding an official-looking envelope. Rose, a man in a suit just delivered this. He said it was urgent legal documents. I knew what it was before I opened it. The petition for guardianship, filed in Cook County Probate Court, requesting that my son Richard Montgomery be appointed as my legal guardian due to my alleged mental incompetence and inability to manage my own affairs. The document was 6 pages of lies, half-truths, and manipulated facts designed to paint me as a confused, vulnerable elderly woman who posed a danger to herself and others. They'd twisted every minor incident into evidence of cognitive decline, every normal human mistake into proof of incompetence. According to the petition, I suffered from significant memory impairment, evidenced by my failure to pay bills on time. I displayed confusion and disorientation based on the parking lot incident. I showed paranoid behavior and social isolation because of the misunderstanding with Mrs. Henderson. I exhibited poor judgment and decision-making capacity by refusing their reasonable suggestions about assisted living. The most infuriating part was the financial section, where they claimed I was living in poverty and unable to afford necessary home maintenance or medical care. They painted a picture of a struggling elderly woman barely surviving on government benefits, completely unaware that they were describing someone worth nearly $5 million. They'd included sworn statements from each family member describing their concerns about my mental state. Patricia's statement claimed I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult to reason with. Marcus described me as, quote, confused and often unable to follow simple conversations. Ashley wrote that I seemed lost and overwhelmed by basic daily tasks. All lies. All deliberate misrepresentations designed to convince a judge that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. But the most devastating part was Richard's statement. My own son, the boy I had raised alone, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, had written 2 pages describing his mother as mentally incompetent and dangerous to herself. He claimed I was living in denial about my declining capabilities and making irrational decisions that put my safety at risk. He'd signed his name to legal documents declaring that his mother was no longer mentally competent. For money, for a house, for assets he didn't even know the true value of. I sat at my kitchen table reading these lies, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I cried. Not from fear or confusion, but from grief. The family I'd loved and sacrificed for had just tried to legally destroy me based on complete fabrications. But my tears didn't last long. Grief quickly transformed into something much more powerful, absolute determination to make them pay for what they'd done. I called Thomas immediately. "They filed the petition," I said without preamble. "I was expecting that. Have you read it?" "Every word, Thomas, it's all lies. Every single accusation is either a complete fabrication or a deliberate misrepresentation of normal incidents." That's what I figured. "Rose, we need to meet today. We're going to file a response that will not only defeat their petition, but potentially expose them to legal consequences for filing false documents." "What kind of consequences?" "Perjury charges if we can prove they knowingly made false statements. Civil liability for elder abuse and financial manipulation. Possibly sanctions from the court for filing a frivolous petition. I want all of it. I want them to face every possible consequence for what they've done." "Consider it done. Can you be here at 2 o'clock? "I'll be there." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and preparations. Dr. Chen immediately agreed to provide additional testimony about my mental state. Janet Morrison at the bank expressed outrage at the financial claims in the petition and offered to provide detailed records proving my financial competence. Father Santos was appalled that a family would make such accusations and volunteered to testify about my active participation in church activities and community service. By the time I arrived at Thomas's office, he had assembled a legal response that was devastating in its thoroughness. "Rose, this isn't just a response to their petition," he said, spreading documents across his conference table. "This is a complete demolition of their case, plus a counterattack that will make them wish they'd never started this fight." The response was over 50 pages long, with exhibits that included complete medical records showing no cognitive impairment, detailed financial statements proving my competence in managing complex investments, character references from 6 different professionals and community members, a timeline showing the pattern of manipulation and financial pressure from my family, evidence that their claims about my poverty and declining mental state were fabricated, documentation of their threats and attempts to coerce me into signing over. "We're asking for sanctions against them for filing false documents. We're requesting a restraining order, preventing them from interfering with your life. And we're putting them on notice that we're considering criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud." Will it work? Rose, this is the most comprehensive competency defense I've ever prepared. When the court sees this evidence, not only will they deny the guardianship petition, they'll question how it was ever filed in the first place. What happens next? We file our response tomorrow. The court will schedule a hearing within 30 days. Your family will have the opportunity to present their evidence, and we'll present ours. But honestly, after the judge reviews our documentation, I doubt the hearing will last very long. And then? Then you'll be officially vindicated, your family will face potential legal consequences, and you'll be free to live your life on your own terms without any further interference. That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of my competence and my family's deception. Medical records, financial statements, character references, legal documents. The paper trail of a 70-year-old woman who'd been systematically underestimated and deliberately misrepresented by the people who should have protected her. But I also looked around at my home, my sanctuary, the place they'd wanted to force me to sell. Every piece of furniture held memories. Every photograph told a story. Every room represented decades of life lived on my own terms. They'd tried to take all of this away from me. Not because I was incompetent or dangerous, but because they wanted the money they thought it represented. Well, they were about to learn that their greed had cost them far more than they'd ever imagined. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. I was having my coffee and reading the newspaper when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw Richard and Patricia standing on my front porch, both looking grim and determined. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "What do you want?" "Mom, we need to talk," Richard said. "Can we come in?" "I don't think that's a good idea. We're involved in legal proceedings now. Anything you want to say to me should probably go through lawyers." Patricia stepped forward, her voice taking on that fake sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Rose, we're family. We should be able to work this out without involving the courts. We were family when you threatened to have me declared incompetent. We were family when you filed legal documents full of lies about my mental state. We were family when you tried to force me out of my home for your own financial benefit. Where was this concern about family then? Mom, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be, Richard said. We're just trying to help you. By having me declared mentally incompetent, by claiming I'm living in poverty, by suggesting I'm dangerous to myself. Richard, I've read your petition, every word of it. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mom, we had to present evidence of our concerns, the lawyer said. The lawyer said to lie about my mental state? To fabricate evidence of cognitive decline? To misrepresent my financial situation? We didn't lie, Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. Didn't you? Patricia, you signed a statement claiming I'm living in poverty and unable to afford basic necessities. Do you know what my actual financial situation is? They exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker in their eyes. For the first time, they seemed to realize they might not know as much about me as they'd assumed. Mom, we know you're on Social Security and you have a small pension, Richard said carefully. And that's all you know, isn't it? You've never asked about my finances. You've never inquired about my investments or my assets. You've just assumed I'm poor and struggling, because that fits the narrative you wanted to believe. What are you saying? Patricia asked. I'm saying you have no idea who you're dealing with. You've filed a legal petition based on assumptions and fabrications, and you're about to discover that there are serious consequences for making false statements to the court. Marcus appeared from around the side of the house, apparently having been waiting in the car. Grandma, this is getting out of hand. Can't we just sit down and work something out? Work what out, Marcus? You signed a statement claiming I'm mentally incompetent. You described me as confused and unable to follow simple conversations. What exactly do you want to work out? I want to understand why you're fighting us so hard on this, he said. We're trying to help you. We want you to be safe and comfortable. In the assisted living facility you chose without asking me, funded by selling the house I don't want to sell. Based on medical concerns you never bothered to verify with my actual doctor. Ashley got out of the car too, completing the family circle on my front porch. Grandma, we love you. We don't want to fight with you. Then why did you sign a legal document claiming I'm mentally incompetent? Because we're worried about you, she said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. Worried about me, or worried about your inheritance? The question hung in the air like smoke. Nobody answered immediately, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Mom, please, Richard started. Leave, now. And don't come back unless you're prepared to apologize for what you've done and withdraw your petition. We can't withdraw it, Patricia said. We've already filed with the court. Then, I guess we'll see each other at the hearing. I closed the door and watched through the window as they had a heated discussion on my front lawn. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language was clear. They were frustrated, confused, and beginning to realize that their simple plan to control their elderly mother wasn't going as smoothly as they'd expected. Good. Let them be confused. Let them wonder what they were missing. In a few weeks, when we faced each other in court, they'd understand exactly how badly they'd underestimated me. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Thomas filed our response on Monday, and by Wednesday, I could see the impact it was having. Richard called twice, leaving voicemails asking if we could discuss the situation before the hearing. Patricia sent a text message suggesting we find a compromise that works for everyone. Too late for compromises. They'd shown me who they really were when they thought I was vulnerable and helpless. Now they were about to learn who I really was when I had the resources and determination to fight back. Thursday evening, the night before the hearing, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Dorothy Peterson and invited her over for dinner. Rose, I'd love to come, she said. Are you doing all right? I've been worried about you since you told me about your family's legal threats. I'm doing better than all right, Dorothy. I'm about to have the best day I've had in years. Dorothy arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and a homemade apple pie. We sat in my dining room, the one my family had wanted me to abandon, and talked about everything except the legal battle that would begin in the morning. You know, Dorothy said as we finished our meal, I've been thinking about what your family is trying to do to you, and it makes me so angry. You're one of the sharpest, most capable people I know, The idea that anyone would consider you incompetent is ridiculous. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Rose, can I ask you something? Of course. What are you telling me about this situation? You seem awfully calm for someone whose family is trying to have her declared incompetent. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Dorothy, tomorrow you're going to understand why I'm so calm. Let's just say my family is in for quite a surprise. What kind of surprise? The kind that will teach them never to underestimate a woman who spent 70 years learning how to take care of herself. Dorothy raised her wine glass. To tomorrow, then, and to showing them what you're really made of. To tomorrow, I agreed, clinking my glass against hers. As Dorothy left that evening, she paused at the door. Rose, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that you have friends who believe in you. People who know exactly how competent and strong you are. Thank you, Dorothy. That means everything. After she left, I spent the evening making final preparations for the hearing. I reviewed my testimony, organized my documents, and mentally prepared for what would either be my vindication or my destruction. But I wasn't worried. For the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my own destiny. My family thought they were going to court tomorrow to have their elderly mother declared incompetent so they could control her meager assets and force her into institutional care. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd picked a fight with someone who had resources, allies, and a determination they couldn't possibly imagine. And when it was over, they would understand that there are consequences for trying to manipulate and control someone who refuses to be a victim. Tomorrow would be the beginning of their education about who Rose Montgomery really was. And it was going to be magnificent. But even as I prepared for victory, part of me mourned what had been lost. These people sitting across from me in court tomorrow had once been the center of my world. I'd loved them, sacrificed for them, dreamed of leaving them a legacy that would make their lives better. Instead, I was about to destroy them in the most public and humiliating way possible. It wasn't what I'd wanted, but it was what they'd chosen when they decided that greed was more important than love, and manipulation was more valuable than respect. Tomorrow they'd learn the cost of that choice. And I would finally be free to live the rest of my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who saw my worth rather than my vulnerability. The battle was about to begin, and I was ready to win it decisively. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Chicago weather that makes everything feel heavy and ominous. But as I dressed for court in my best navy blue suit, the one I'd bought for Richard's college graduation 25 years ago, I felt lighter than I had in months. Today was the day I would finally show my family exactly who they'd been trying to manipulate. Thomas picked me up at 8:30, his car loaded with boxes of evidence that would prove my competence beyond any shadow of doubt. As we drove through the city toward the Cook County Courthouse, he reviewed our strategy one final time. Rose, their attorney is going to try to paint you as a confused, stubborn elderly woman who doesn't understand her own limitations. They'll present their incidents as evidence of cognitive decline and argue that your refusal to accept help proves you lack judgment. And our response? We demonstrate that you're not only competent, but exceptionally capable. We show that their incidents are either normal human experiences or outright fabrications. And we prove that your refusal to cooperate with their demands isn't stubbornness. It's the reasonable response of an intelligent woman who recognized she was being manipulated. What about the financial aspects? Thomas smiled grimly. That's where we destroy them completely. They've built their entire case on the assumption that you're poor and unable to manage your finances. When the court sees your actual financial records, their credibility will be shattered. The courthouse was a massive limestone building that had intimidated people for over a century. As we walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator to the 4th floor, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about my freedom, it was about justice, dignity, and the right of elderly people to control their own lives. Probate Court 402 was a wood-paneled room that smelled of old books and decades of legal proceedings. My family was already there, sitting with their attorney at the petitioner's table. Richard wore his most expensive suit, the one he reserved for important business meetings. Patricia had chosen a conservative dress that made her look professional and concerned. Marcus and Ashley flanked them, both dressed like they were attending a funeral. Which, in a way, they were. The funeral of any remaining relationship between us. They all turned when I entered with Thomas, and I saw something flicker across their faces. Surprise, maybe, at how composed and prepared I looked. They'd expected a confused, overwhelmed elderly woman who would be intimidated by the legal proceedings. Instead, they saw someone who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Chen," the bailiff announced. Judge Chen, no relation to my doctor, was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes that had seen every kind of family drama imaginable. She took her seat and reviewed the files before her, spending several minutes reading both the petition and our response. "This is the matter of Montgomery versus Montgomery," she said finally. "A petition for guardianship filed by Richard Montgomery, seeking appointment as guardian for his mother, Rose Catherine Montgomery, based on allegations of mental incompetence. Mrs. Montgomery is represented by counsel and has filed a comprehensive response challenging these allegations." She looked at both tables with the expression of someone who'd already spotted irregularities in the case. "Mr. Davidson," she said to my family's attorney, "this is an unusual petition. Your clients are alleging severe mental incompetence, but Mrs. Montgomery appears to have retained counsel and filed a sophisticated legal response. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Stephen Davidson was a lawyer who specialized in elder law, though clearly not always for the right reasons. He stood with the practiced confidence of someone who'd convinced many families that elderly relatives needed to be controlled. "Your Honor, it's not uncommon for individuals with declining mental capacity to appear functional in certain situations while struggling significantly in others. Mrs. Montgomery may have been coached by her attorney or may be experiencing a temporary period of clarity." I felt Thomas tense beside me. The suggestion that I'd been coached was both insulting and irrelevant to the legal issues. "I see," Judge Chen said dryly. "And what evidence do you have of this alleged decline in mental capacity?" Davidson opened his file and began presenting the same fabricated incidents my family had included in their petition: the late electric bill during my illness, the confusion in the parking lot, the misunderstanding with Mrs. Henderson. Each incident was presented as evidence of serious cognitive decline rather than normal human experiences. "Your Honor, these incidents demonstrate a pattern of confusion, paranoia, and poor judgment that endangers Mrs. Montgomery's safety and well-being. Her refusal to accept reasonable assistance from her loving family further proves her inability to make rational decisions about her own care." Judge Chen listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Davidson finished, she turned to Thomas. "Mr. Brennan, you filed an extensive response challenging these allegations. Please present your evidence." Thomas stood with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. "Your Honor, we don't just challenge these allegations, we prove they're fundamentally false. Mrs. Montgomery isn't suffering from cognitive decline. She's an exceptionally competent 70-year-old woman who recognized that her family was attempting to manipulate her for financial gain." Over the next hour, Thomas methodically destroyed every aspect of my family's case. He presented Dr. Chen's comprehensive medical evaluation, which found no evidence of cognitive impairment. He showed my financial records, demonstrating 30 years of sophisticated investment management. He read character references from 6 different professionals who testified to my mental sharpness and independence. But the most devastating moment came when Thomas addressed the financial claims in the petition. "Your Honor, the petitioners claim that Mrs. Montgomery is living in poverty and unable to afford basic necessities. This allegation is not just false, it's so wildly inaccurate that it calls into question the petitioner's knowledge of the woman they're trying to control." He handed a document to the judge. "This is Mrs. Montgomery's current financial statement, prepared by her investment advisor and verified by her bank. Far from living in poverty, Mrs. Montgomery has a net worth of approximately $5 million. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I heard Patricia gasp, saw Marcus's mouth fall open, watched Richard's face go pale as the magnitude of their miscalculation became clear. Judge Chen studied the financial statement, her eyebrows rising with each page. "Mr. Brennan, this shows extremely sophisticated financial management, multiple investment accounts, real estate holdings, a diversified portfolio managed over decades. This doesn't suggest cognitive impairment. It suggests exceptional financial competence. Exactly, Your Honor. Mrs. Montgomery has been successfully managing complex investments for 30 years. She pays all bills on time, maintains excellent credit, and makes sound financial decisions. The petitioner's claim that she's financially incompetent is not just wrong. It suggests they know very little about the woman they're trying to control. Judge Chen turned back to Davidson. Counselor, how do you reconcile your client's claims about Mrs. Montgomery's poverty with these financial records? Davidson was clearly struggling. Your Honor, the family wasn't aware of the full extent of Mrs. Montgomery's assets. This information wasn't available to them when they filed the petition. They didn't ask, Thomas interjected. They made assumptions about Mrs. Montgomery's financial situation, without ever inquiring about her actual assets or consulting with her financial advisors. This suggests their petition was based on wishful thinking rather than factual evidence. The judge's expression was growing increasingly skeptical. Mr. Davidson, let me understand this correctly. Your clients are seeking guardianship over someone they believe is financially incompetent, but they never bothered to determine her actual financial status? Your Honor, they were concerned about her ability to manage her daily affairs, based on 3 minor incidents over several months, and without consulting her physician, her financial advisors, or anyone else who might have relevant information about her competence? Davidson was floundering now. Your Honor, the family was acting out of genuine concern. Were they? Judge Chen's voice was sharp. Mr. Brennan, didn't your response include allegations that the petitioners were pressuring Mrs. Montgomery to sell her home and move to assisted living? Yes, Your Honor. They toured assisted living facilities without her knowledge, spoke to real estate agents about selling her house, and threatened legal action when she refused to cooperate with their plans. And they did all of this while believing she was living in poverty? Apparently so, Your Honor. Judge Chen turned to my family's table, and her expression was not sympathetic. Let me be clear about what I'm seeing here. You filed a petition claiming your mother is mentally incompetent and financially irresponsible, but you never consulted her doctor, never reviewed her actual financial records, and never made any effort to verify the claims you're making. Instead, you made plans to control her living situation and dispose of her assets based on assumptions that were wildly incorrect. Richard stood up, his face flushed. Your Honor, we were trying to help our mother. We were concerned about her safety. Sit down, Mr. Montgomery. You'll have your opportunity to testify. The judge turned back to Thomas. Mr. Brennan, do you have additional evidence to present? Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to call Mrs. Montgomery to testify on her own behalf. I stood and walked to the witness stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on me. This was my moment to speak for myself, to show the judge and my family exactly who they were dealing with. The bailiff swore me in, and I took my seat facing the room. From this angle, I could see my family clearly. Richard looked sick. Patricia appeared to be calculating something frantically in her head. Marcus and Ashley just looked stunned. Thomas approached the witness stand with gentle professionalism. Mrs. Montgomery, how old are you? I'm 70 years old. And how long have you lived independently? I've lived independently for 33 years, since my husband died when I was 37. During that time, have you managed your own finances? Yes. I've managed all my financial affairs, including complex investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and tax planning. Have you ever been diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other cognitive impairment? No. Dr. Chen recently completed comprehensive testing and found no evidence of cognitive decline. Mrs. Montgomery, your family claims you forgot to pay your electric bill. Can you explain what happened? I had the flu for a week in February and was unable to leave bed for several days. During that time, I fell behind on some routine tasks, including bill paying. As soon as I recovered, I caught up on all my bills and paid any late fees. This is documented in my financial records. And the incident in the parking lot where you couldn't find your car? I was distracted by a phone call from my doctor's office while walking into the store. When I came out with my groceries, I momentarily forgot which section I'd parked in. It took me 5 minutes to locate my car. I was embarrassed and called my son for reassurance, not because I was confused about my surroundings. What about the misunderstanding with your neighbor about garden tools? I couldn't find my pruning shears and saw Mrs. Henderson using a pair that looked identical to mine. I asked if they were mine, and she said no. When I found my shears in the garage the next day, I immediately apologized for the confusion. Mrs. Henderson and I have spoken since then, and she considers the matter completely resolved. Thomas nodded. Mrs. Montgomery, your family wants you to move to assisted living. How do you feel about that? I don't need assisted living. I maintain my own home, manage my own affairs, drive safely, stay socially active, and live independently without assistance. Moving to institutional care would be a significant step backward for someone in my situation. And they want you to sell your house? Yes, to pay for the assisted living I don't need. My house is paid off, well-maintained, and worth approximately $400,000. I have no desire to sell it and no financial need to do so. Mrs. Montgomery, do you understand why your family filed this petition? I paused, looking directly at Richard. I believe they filed this petition because they wanted to control my assets and my living situation for their own benefit. They assumed I was poor and vulnerable, and they saw an opportunity to manipulate me into decisions that would benefit them financially. And how did you respond to their attempts at manipulation? I refused to cooperate. I maintained my independence and made my own decisions about my life. When they threatened legal action, I retained counsel and prepared to defend myself. Thomas smiled. Mrs. Montgomery, in your opinion, are you mentally competent to manage your own affairs? Absolutely. I've been managing my own affairs successfully for 7 decades. I have no intention of stopping now. Thank you, no further questions. Davidson's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that my financial success was due to luck rather than skill, that my independence was stubbornness rather than competence, that my refusal to cooperate proved poor judgment rather than strength. But every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate my mental clarity, my thorough understanding of my situation, and my complete competence to make my own decisions. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I could see that the hearing was essentially over. Judge Chen had heard enough to make her decision. Mr. Davidson, does your client wish to testify? Davidson conferred briefly with Richard, then shook his head. No, Your Honor. Smart choice. Anything Richard said at this point would only make things worse for them. Judge Chen spent 5 minutes reviewing her notes, then looked up with an expression that could have frozen water. I've heard enough. This petition is not just without merit, it's frivolous and potentially abusive. Mrs. Montgomery is clearly a competent, intelligent woman who is fully capable of managing her own affairs. The evidence presented by the petitioners consists of minor, normal incidents that have been blown out of proportion and misrepresented as signs of cognitive decline. She turned to my family's table and her voice became stern. More troubling is the evidence that this petition was filed as part of an attempt to manipulate and control Mrs. Montgomery for financial reasons. The petitioners made no effort to verify their claims about her mental state or financial situation before seeking to have her declared incompetent. This suggests the petition was filed in bad faith. Richard tried to interrupt. Your Honor, we were genuinely concerned. Mr. Montgomery, you were concerned enough to file legal documents seeking control over your mother's life, but not concerned enough to speak with her doctor or review her actual financial situation. That's not concern, that's manipulation. Judge Chen picked up her gavel. The petition for guardianship is denied in its entirety. Mrs. Montgomery will continue to manage her own affairs without interference from the petitioners. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing the petitioners from attempting to interfere with Mrs. Montgomery's living situation, financial affairs, or personal autonomy. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Additionally, Judge Chen continued, I'm referring this matter to the state's attorney's office for review of potential elder abuse charges. Filing false documents in an attempt to gain control over an elderly person's assets may constitute criminal fraud. My family sat in stunned silence as the full implications of their defeat sank in. Not only had they lost their case completely, but they now faced potential criminal charges for their attempt to manipulate me. Thomas gathered our documents while I stood and smoothed my skirt. The hearing was over. and I had won more decisively than I dared to hope. As we prepared to leave, Richard stood up and called across the courtroom, "Mom, can we talk?" I looked at him for a long moment, this son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had just tried to have me declared incompetent for money. "No, Richard, we can't talk. You made your choice when you filed that petition. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Patricia stood up too, her voice shrill with desperation. "Rose, this is all a misunderstanding. We can work this out." "There's nothing to work out, Patricia. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought I was helpless. I won't forget that lesson." Marcus and Ashley looked like they wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could they say? That they were sorry for trying to have their grandmother declared mentally incompetent? That they hadn't really meant the lies they'd signed their names to? Too little, too late. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high and my independence intact. But more than that, I walked out with the knowledge that I had defended myself successfully against people who'd tried to destroy me. They'd underestimated me completely. They'd thought I was weak, poor, confused, and vulnerable. Instead, they discovered that I was strong, wealthy, sharp, and absolutely prepared to fight for my rights. But the hearing was just the beginning. They still didn't understand the full scope of what they'd lost by trying to manipulate me. That revelation would come later, when they learned about my new will and discovered exactly what their greed and betrayal had cost them. For now, it was enough to savor the victory and the look of shock on their faces when they realized they'd picked a fight with someone who was far more formidable than they'd ever imagined. As Thomas and I left the courthouse, he turned to me with a smile. "Rose, that was one of the most satisfying hearings I've ever participated in. You were magnificent." "Thank you, but Thomas, this isn't over yet." "What do you mean?" "They still don't know about the will. They still think they're going to inherit my assets someday. They need to understand that there are permanent consequences for what they tried to do to me." "When do you want to finalize the new estate plan?" "As soon as possible. I want everything signed and filed before they have a chance to cause any more trouble." As we drove through the city, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced in months. I had stood up to bullies, defended my rights, and proven my competence beyond any doubt. But more importantly, I had taken control of my own story. No longer would I be the victim of other people's greed and manipulation. No longer would I allow anyone to underestimate my strength or my capabilities. I was Rose Montgomery, a 70-year-old woman who had just defeated her entire family in court and was about to shock them with revelations they never saw coming. And I was just getting started. 3 months later, on a beautiful June morning when the roses in my garden were in full bloom, I woke up feeling unusually tired. Not the exhaustion of illness, but the deep weariness of someone who had fought a long battle and was finally ready to rest. I'd lived those 3 months exactly as I'd wanted to, on my own terms, in my own home, making my own decisions. The restraining order had kept my family at bay, though I'd heard through Dorothy that they were all dealing with the fallout from the failed guardianship petition. Richard had been forced to take a leave of absence from work, while the state's attorney investigated potential elder abuse charges. Patricia's real estate business had suffered when word spread about their attempt to manipulate me. Marcus and Ashley were reportedly mortified that their friends and colleagues had learned about their role in trying to have their grandmother declared incompetent. But I hadn't spoken to any of them directly. They'd made their choice when they filed those papers, and I'd made mine when I walked out of that courtroom with my dignity intact. During those months, I'd also finalized my estate plan with Thomas. The Montgomery Foundation for Elder Advocacy was officially established, with comprehensive guidelines for how the money should be used to help elderly people maintain their independence and fight family manipulation. I'd specified that the foundation should fund legal aid for seniors facing guardianship challenges, support programs for aging in place, and educate families about the difference between genuine care and financial control. I'd also made specific bequests to people who had shown me genuine kindness and respect. Dr. Chen would receive enough money to establish a scholarship fund for geriatric medical students. Janet Morrison would find herself with a substantial sum that would allow her to retire comfortably. Father Santos would be able to fund the community outreach programs he'd always dreamed of expanding. Dorothy Peterson would have financial security for the rest of her life. And my family? My family would receive a very detailed explanation of why they'd been excluded from my will, along with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered about their manipulation and betrayal. The will reading was scheduled for exactly 6 months after their failed court challenge, a timing I'd chosen deliberately. I wanted them to have time to fully understand what they'd lost before they learned about the inheritance they'd forfeited. But that June morning, as I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching the sunrise through windows they'd wanted to force me to abandon, I felt something shift inside me. A peace I hadn't experienced in years, coupled with a strange certainty that my time was drawing to a close. I wasn't afraid. I'd lived 70 years on my own terms, raised a son, built wealth from nothing, defended my independence against all challengers, and created a legacy that would help other elderly people long after I was gone. If this was my time, I was ready. I called Thomas and asked him to move up the will reading. "Rose, is everything all right? You sound different." "I'm fine, Thomas. I just think it's time to set things in motion. How quickly can you arrange the reading?" "If it's urgent, I can have everyone notified for next week. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure. And Thomas?" "Make sure my family understands that attendance is mandatory if they want to know anything about their inheritance. I want them all there." "Consider it done." The invitations went out the next day. Formal legal notices requiring the presence of all named parties at the reading of Rose Catherine Montgomery's last will and testament. The language made it clear that failure to attend would result in forfeiture of any potential inheritance. I spent the following week putting my affairs in perfect order. I wrote personal letters to the people who would receive bequests, explaining what their friendship and respect had meant to me. I organized all my important documents and made sure Thomas had everything he needed to execute my wishes. I even cleaned my house thoroughly, wanting to leave everything in perfect condition. On the morning of the will reading, I dressed in my best outfit, a burgundy dress I'd bought for my 65th birthday but rarely worn. I wanted to look dignified and composed for this final confrontation with my family. The reading was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Thomas's office. I arrived early, wanting to be settled and ready when my family walked into what they expected would be a routine inheritance discussion. Thomas had arranged the conference room with careful attention to the psychological impact of the setting. A long mahogany table with my family seated on one side, facing Thomas and me on the other. The will itself, bound in legal blue, sat in the center of the table like evidence in a trial. They arrived together, just as they had for their disastrous intervention 3 months earlier. Richard, Patricia, Marcus, and Ashley, all dressed in conservative black clothing that made them look like they were attending a funeral. Which, in a way, they were the funeral of their expectations and their relationship with me. Richard looked older than his 50 years, worn down by months of legal stress and professional consequences. Patricia's usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. Marcus and Ashley both looked uncomfortable, as if they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. They took their seats without looking directly at me, their eyes focused on the document that would determine their financial future. After months of legal battles and family destruction, they were finally going to learn what they'd inherit from the grandmother they'd tried to control. Thomas stood and addressed the room with formal gravity. "We're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Rose Catherine Montgomery, executed 6 weeks ago and properly witnessed according to Illinois state law." He picked up the will and opened it to the first page. "Before I begin reading the specific provisions, I want to note that Mrs. Montgomery specifically requested that all named parties be present for this reading. She wanted her intentions to be heard directly and understood completely." Richard shifted in his seat, probably calculating in his head how my assets would be divided among them. Based on what they'd learned in court about my wealth, they were expecting substantial inheritances that would solve all their financial problems. They had no idea what was actually coming. Thomas began reading in his clear, professional voice. "I, Rose Catherine Montgomery, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my last will and testament." Standard legal language that revealed nothing. My family listened intently, waiting for the important parts. First, I want to address the circumstances that led to the creation of this will. 6 months ago, my son Richard Montgomery, daughter-in-law Patricia Montgomery, grandson Marcus Montgomery, and granddaughter Ashley Montgomery attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent in order to gain control of my assets and force me into institutional care. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My family had been expecting a routine reading of bequests and inheritance amounts. Instead, they were hearing a detailed accounting of their own betrayal. Thomas continued reading my words. This legal action was based entirely on fabricated evidence and deliberate misrepresentations of my mental state. They filed sworn statements claiming I was living in poverty and unable to manage my affairs, when in fact I have successfully managed complex financial investments for over 30 years and maintain a net worth of approximately $5 million. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Even knowing about my wealth from the court hearing it stated so clearly in legal documents seemed to shock her all over again. The guardianship petition was denied completely, with the judge finding that my family had acted in bad faith and referring the matter for criminal investigation. However, the damage to our relationship was irreversible. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was vulnerable and helpless. Richard started to speak, but Thomas held up a hand. Please hold all comments until I've finished reading the entire document. Therefore, Thomas continued, I have decided to structure my estate in a way that reflects my values and rewards the people who have shown me genuine respect and kindness, rather than those who saw me only as a source of financial benefit. This was the moment when my family would begin to understand the true cost of their manipulation and greed. To my son Richard Montgomery, who attempted to have me declared incompetent for his own financial gain, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid in pennies. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications sank in. To my daughter-in-law, Patricia Montgomery, who signed false documents claiming I was mentally incompetent and living in poverty, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid in pennies. Patricia made a strangled sound, like she was choking on air. To my grandson Marcus Montgomery, who described me as confused and unable to follow simple conversations, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid in pennies. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. To my granddaughter Ashley Montgomery, who claimed I was lost and overwhelmed by basic daily tasks, I leave the sum of $1, to be paid in pennies. Ashley burst into tears, the reality of what they'd lost finally hitting her. Thomas turned the page and continued reading. I want to be clear about why I have chosen to exclude my family from any meaningful inheritance. It is not because I stopped loving them, but because they stopped seeing me as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. They saw me only as an obstacle to their financial security, and they were willing to destroy my reputation and independence to get what they wanted. The restraining order that remains in effect until my death prevented them from contacting me to apologize or make amends. But even if they had been able to apologize, the damage was done. Trust, once broken, cannot be fully repaired. Love, once betrayed, cannot be completely restored. Richard found his voice, shaky and desperate. Mom, you can't do this. We're your family. We made mistakes, but... Mr. Montgomery, Thomas said firmly, interrupting the will reading is inappropriate and won't change the contents of the document. Please allow me to finish. I watched my family's faces as Thomas continued reading, seeing the full scope of their loss dawn on them gradually. They'd expected to inherit millions of dollars. Instead, they were getting $4 in pennies and a public accounting of their failures as human beings. The bulk of my estate, approximately $4.8 million, will be used to establish the Montgomery Foundation for Elder Advocacy, dedicated to helping elderly people maintain their independence and protecting them from family manipulation. Thomas read the detailed description of the Foundation's mission, including programs for legal aid, aging-in-place support, and education about elder abuse. Every word was a reminder that their greed had cost them not just money, but the chance to be part of a meaningful legacy. Additionally, I am making the following specific bequests to people who showed me genuine kindness and respect during the final years of my life. He read through the list of beneficiaries. Dr. Chen would receive $200,000 for her geriatric medicine scholarship fund. Janet Morrison would get $150,000 for her years of professional financial guidance. Father Santos would receive $100,000 for community programs. Dorothy Peterson would get $200,000 to ensure her comfortable retirement. My housekeeper, mail carrier, and several other people who'd treated me with consistent kindness would each receive substantial gifts. Finally, Thomas read, I want my family to understand that this will is not an act of revenge, but an act of justice. They chose to see me as a means to an end, rather than a person worthy of love and respect. This document reflects that choice and its consequences. I hope that someday they will understand that the real inheritance I wanted to leave them, love, respect, family unity, and the knowledge that they had honored rather than exploited their elderly mother and grandmother, was worth far more than money. But they chose money over love, control over respect, and manipulation over honor. This will simply reflect those choices. Thomas closed the document and set it on the table. That concludes the reading of Rose Catherine Montgomery's last will and testament. The document has been filed with the probate court and will be executed according to its terms. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My family sat frozen, staring at the will as if it might change if they looked at it hard enough. Finally, Richard found his voice. This isn't legal. She can't disinherit her entire family. We'll contest it. Thomas smiled grimly. Mr. Montgomery, this will was prepared with extensive documentation of your mother's mental competence. We have medical evaluations, cognitive testing, video recordings of the signing ceremony, and testimony from multiple professionals. Moreover, the will explicitly explains her reasoning for these decisions, referencing the failed guardianship petition and your attempts to manipulate her. But we're her family, Patricia said, her voice breaking. She can't leave us nothing. She didn't leave you nothing, Thomas replied. She left each of you exactly what your behavior earned, $1 in pennies, and a clear explanation of why you forfeited any claim to her love or her money. Ashley was sobbing now, the sound raw and heartbroken. Grandma, please, we're sorry. We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought we were helping. Quote, I looked at her, this granddaughter who had once claimed to love me, who had signed legal documents declaring me mentally incompetent. Ashley, you signed a statement saying I was lost and overwhelmed by basic tasks. You did that, knowing it wasn't true, because you wanted to control my money. That's not help. That's theft. Marcus tried a different approach. Grandma, we were misguided, but we can change. We can be better. Don't let one mistake destroy our entire family. One mistake? I repeated. Marcus, you spent months building a case against my mental competence. You coordinated with your parents to manipulate and control me. You were willing to have me declared incompetent and forced into institutional care for money. That's not a mistake. That's a calculated betrayal. Richard stood up, his face red with anger and desperation. Mom, this is cruel. We're your flesh and blood. We made errors in judgment, but we don't deserve this. Don't I deserve respect? Don't I deserve autonomy? Don't I deserve to have my own family treat me like a person rather than a source of income? I stood too, facing the son I'd raised alone, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally. Richard, you were willing to have me declared incompetent. You were willing to force me out of my home. You were willing to control every aspect of my life for money. What exactly do you think you deserve after that? Patricia tried once more, her voice shrill with panic. Rose, this will destroy the family forever. Your grandchildren will never forgive you for this. They destroyed the family when they tried to have me declared incompetent, I said calmly. I'm simply documenting the destruction they chose to create. Thomas stood and began gathering the documents. The will has been read and filed. The estate will be settled according to its terms. If you have any legal questions, you can contact my office. As my family filed out, each of them looked at me with different expressions. Richard with anger and disbelief. Patricia with calculation, probably already thinking about legal challenges they couldn't afford and wouldn't win. Marcus with shame and regret. Ashley with heartbreak and the dawning understanding of what they'd lost. But I felt no satisfaction in their pain, no joy in their defeat. I felt only the peace that comes from finally setting things right. After they left, Thomas and I sat alone in the conference room. Rose, how do you feel? Quote, Free, I said simply. For the first time in months, I feel completely free. Any regrets? I considered the question carefully. I regret that it came to this. I regret that they chose greed over love. I regret that my grandchildren will grow up knowing they tried to have their grandmother declared incompetent for money, but I don't regret protecting myself, and I don't regret ensuring that my money will help other elderly people maintain their dignity. The foundation will do tremendous good. That's what matters now, not the family that betrayed me, but the families that can be saved from similar betrayals. As I drove home from that final confrontation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my decisions. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be the person others needed me to be. The devoted wife, the sacrificing mother, the accommodating grandmother. I'd swallowed my pride, ignored my needs, and put everyone else's comfort before my own autonomy. Not anymore. I'd finally learned to put myself first, to value my own dignity over other people's expectations, to choose justice over family harmony. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set, surrounded by the roses I'd planted and tended for decades. The house behind me was mine, secured forever from people who wanted to sell it out from under me. The bank accounts were mine, protected from relatives who saw them as solutions to their own problems. The decisions about my future were mine, free from family members who thought they knew better than I did what was good for me. I'd won. More than that, I'd won on my own terms, using my own resources, fighting my own battles. I'd proven that a 70-year-old woman could defend herself against manipulation and control. I'd shown that age doesn't automatically equal vulnerability, and that underestimating elderly people can be a very expensive mistake. But most importantly, I'd ensured that my life's work would continue helping people long after I was gone. The Montgomery Foundation would fight for other elderly people facing the same manipulation I'd experienced. My money would fund legal aid, support services, and education programs that would help families understand the difference between genuine care and financial exploitation. My family had seen me as a source of inheritance. Instead, I'd become a source of justice for people they'd never meet. 3 weeks later, on a peaceful Sunday morning, I didn't wake up. Dorothy found me that afternoon when I didn't answer her calls, sitting peacefully in my favorite chair with a book in my lap and a slight smile on my face. The funeral was well attended by friends, neighbors, medical professionals, and financial advisors who'd known the real Rose Montgomery. People who'd respected my intelligence, valued my friendship, and recognized my strength. My family sat in the front row, dressed in black, mourning not just my death but the inheritance they'd forfeited through their own greed and manipulation. They'd lost a mother and grandmother, but more importantly, they'd lost the chance to be the kind of people who deserved to be loved and trusted by someone who'd spent 70 years learning how to build wealth, maintain dignity, and fight for what was right. The Montgomery Foundation began its work immediately, and within a year it had helped dozens of elderly people fight off family manipulation, maintain their independence, and protect their assets from relatives who saw them as sources of income rather than human beings deserving of respect. And sometimes, when foundation lawyers helped elderly clients defend themselves against manipulative family members, they'd tell them about Rose Catherine Montgomery, the 70-year-old woman who'd been underestimated by her own family and turned that underestimation into the most satisfying victory of her life. Because that's what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, age for vulnerability, and love for stupidity. You discover that the sweet old lady you thought you could manipulate was actually a force of nature who'd been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of fight for her entire life. And she was magnificent.